You're standing on the deck of a massive cruise ship, surrounded by thousands of passengers, feeling completely safe in the middle of the endless ocean. But what if I told you that over 400 people have vanished from cruise ships in the past 2 decades, most never to be seen again? What if I told you that some of these disappearances weren't accidents, but something far more sinister? Tonight, we're diving into 10 of the most disturbing true stories that happened aboard cruise ships, where paradise turned into a living nightmare and luxury became a floating prison. From passengers who mysteriously vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their belongings and unanswered questions, to ships that became death traps when everything went catastrophically wrong. We'll explore cases where crew members turned predator, where corporate greed led to unimaginable suffering, and where the vast ocean became a dumping ground for secrets that were never meant to surface. These aren't urban legends or fictional tales designed to scare you. These are documented cases with real victims, real families still searching for answers, and real cover-ups that will make your blood run cold. You'll hear about Amy Bradley, who vanished from her family's dream vacation and was later spotted in horrifying circumstances that suggest a fate worse than death. You'll learn about the Carnival Triumph, dubbed the Poop Cruise, where 4,000 passengers were trapped for days in conditions so deplorable that grown adults were reduced to animals fighting for survival. We'll uncover the truth behind Captain Schettino's cowardice that cost 32 lives, and the systematic sexual assaults that cruise lines desperately tried to hide from the public. Before we begin this journey into the darkest corners of maritime horror, make sure to click that subscribe button and hit the bell icon, because once you hear these stories, you'll never look at a cruise ship the same way again. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why some travel experts call cruise ships floating cities of crime, where international waters become a lawless frontier and passengers become prey. So dim the lights, because we're about to embark on a voyage through real-life horror stories that prove sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't fictional. They're the ones wearing uniforms, selling you dreams, and counting on the fact that what happens at sea stays at sea. Story 1. The Vanishing of Amy Lynn Bradley. On March 24, 1998, 23-year-old Amy Lynn Bradley was living what should have been the perfect dream vacation aboard Royal Caribbean's Rhapsody of the Seas with her parents Ron and Iva and her brother Brad. Amy was a beautiful, vibrant college graduate who had just finished her degree in physical education at Longwood University in Virginia, and this 7-day Caribbean cruise was meant to be a celebration of her achievements and a bonding experience with her close-knit family. The Bradleys were typical American tourists from Petersburg, Virginia, excited to explore the tropical paradise of Curaçao, Barbados, and other exotic destinations, never imagining that their daughter would become the center of one of the most disturbing maritime mysteries in modern history. Amy was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered, with her infectious laugh, striking green eyes and adventurous spirit that made her the life of any party. But it was precisely these qualities that may have made her a target for something unthinkably sinister. Standing 5 feet 7 inches tall with long brown hair and an athletic build from years of playing basketball and swimming competitively, Amy was the type of young woman who naturally drew attention wherever she went, and unfortunately, on this cruise, that attention would come from all the wrong people. The Rhapsody of the Seas was a massive floating city, stretching over 915 feet long and carrying nearly 2,400 passengers along with 765 crew members from dozens of different countries, creating a complex environment where anyone could easily disappear into the crowd. The ship boasted multiple decks filled with restaurants, bars, pools, a casino, shopping areas, and entertainment venues. But what passengers didn't know was that this maze-like structure also provided countless hiding places and blind spots where predators could operate without detection. The Bradley family had booked a cabin on the upper Aloha deck with a private balcony, thinking they were treating themselves to a luxurious experience, but they had unknowingly placed themselves in one of the most vulnerable positions on the ship, where their daughter could be easily monitored and targeted by those who knew how to exploit the cruise ship's security weaknesses. From the moment they boarded in Puerto Rico on March 21st, Amy had been enjoying herself immensely, participating in all the ship's activities, making friends with fellow passengers, and embracing the carefree atmosphere that cruise lines work so hard to create. She was photographed constantly throughout the cruise, smiling and laughing with her family, dancing at the nightly parties, and seeming to embody everything that cruise advertisements promise about the perfect vacation experience. On the evening of March 23rd, the family had been enjoying the ship's vibrant nightlife, with Amy particularly drawn to the music and dancing at the Boleros Lounge, where a live band called Blue Orchid was performing. The band members, who were contract workers from various Caribbean islands, had been interacting closely with passengers throughout the cruise, and several witnesses later reported seeing Amy engaged in lengthy conversations with one particular band member who went by the nickname Yellow. This interaction would later become a crucial piece of evidence that authorities largely ignored, despite multiple passengers reporting that Yellow seemed unusually interested in Amy and had been asking detailed questions about her family, their cabin location, and their travel plans. The atmosphere that night was electric, with passengers drinking heavily and letting their guard down in ways they never would at home, creating the perfect environment for predators to identify and isolate their targets. Amy had been dancing and socializing until well after midnight, appearing to be having the time of her life, completely unaware that she was being carefully observed and assessed by individuals who saw her not as a person, but as a potential commodity in a market that trades in human suffering. Around 1:30 a.m. on March 24th, Amy returned to the family cabin with her brother Brad, who later reported that she seemed slightly intoxicated but in good spirits, talking excitedly about the evening's events and making plans for the next day's activities in Curaçao. Brad went to sleep immediately, exhausted from the night's festivities, while Amy decided to step out onto the cabin's private balcony to get some fresh air and possibly smoke a cigarette before turning in for the night. Their father, Ron Bradley, had been dozing in a chair near the balcony door and remembered seeing Amy sitting outside around 5:30 a.m., looking peaceful and content as she gazed out at the dark ocean, the lights of Curaçao beginning to appear on the horizon as the ship approached its next port of call. Ron fell back asleep for what he thought was just a few minutes, but when he woke up around 6 a.m., Amy was gone, her cigarettes and lighter left behind on the small balcony table, as if she had simply stepped away for a moment and planned to return. The chair was still warm, suggesting she had only recently left, but there was no sign of her anywhere in the immediate area, and the balcony door was still open, swaying gently in the early morning breeze. Initially, the family thought Amy might have gone for an early morning jog around the ship's deck, as she was an avid athlete who maintained a strict fitness routine and often exercised at unusual hours to avoid crowds. They waited for about 30 minutes, expecting her to return with stories about watching the sunrise or meeting interesting fellow early risers, but when she failed to appear for breakfast, a gnawing sense of dread began to consume them. Ron and Brad began searching the ship systematically, checking every restaurant, pool area, lounge, and public space, asking other passengers if they had seen Amy and growing increasingly frantic as each location turned up empty. The ship was scheduled to dock in Curaçao at 9 a.m., and the family realized with growing horror that if Amy had somehow gotten off the ship, finding her in a foreign country would become exponentially more difficult. At 7:50 a.m., just over an hour before the ship was scheduled to dock, the Bradley family finally approached the ship's security office to report Amy missing, but their encounter with cruise staff would prove to be almost as disturbing as their daughter's disappearance itself. The ship's security team, led by a man who identified himself only as the head of security, treated the Bradleys' frantic pleas for help with a level of indifference and incompetence that seemed almost deliberately obstructive. Instead of immediately implementing emergency procedures or conducting a thorough search of the ship, security personnel suggested that Amy had probably just hooked up with someone and would turn up eventually, a response that revealed a shocking lack of professionalism and basic human decency. When the family insisted that Amy would never disappear without telling them, especially with the ship about to dock in a foreign port, security officers rolled their eyes and made it clear they considered this a routine case of a young woman having too much fun on vacation. The Bradleys demanded that the ship's departure from Curaçao be delayed so they could search for Amy on the island, but they were told that the cruise line's schedule was more important than one missing passenger, and the ship would be leaving as planned regardless of whether Amy was found. This response should have been the first major red flag that something was seriously wrong with how Royal Caribbean handled missing person cases, but it was only the beginning of what would become a systematic pattern of obstruction and cover-up. What made the security team's behavior even more suspicious was their immediate insistence that Amy must have fallen overboard, despite the complete lack of evidence to support this theory. The balcony railings were over 4 feet high. Amy was completely sober by 5:30 a.m., and she was an excellent swimmer who had no history of suicidal thoughts or reckless behavior. More importantly, passengers who fall overboard typically leave behind some evidence of their fall, such as disturbed furniture, torn clothing, or personal items scattered around the area. But Amy's cigarettes and lighter were sitting undisturbed exactly where she had left them, as if she had simply stood up and walked away. The ship's crew also claimed that their security cameras had malfunctioned during the crucial hours when Amy disappeared, a convenient technical failure that prevented any review of footage that might have shown what actually happened to her. When the Bradley family demanded to see the security recordings anyway, they were told that the footage had already been destroyed as part of routine maintenance, despite the fact that Amy had only been missing for a few hours and no proper investigation had even begun. As the ship docked in Curaçao, the Bradleys made the agonizing decision to get off and search for Amy on the island, while the rest of the passengers continued their vacation as if nothing had happened. Curaçao, while marketed to tourists as a tropical paradise, has a dark underbelly that cruise lines deliberately ignore, serving as a major hub for human trafficking operations that span across the Caribbean, South America, and even parts of Europe. The island's location, combined with its complex political status as a Dutch territory with limited law enforcement resources, makes it an ideal transit point for criminal organizations that specialize in kidnapping young women and forcing them into sexual slavery. Local authorities in Curaçao were poorly equipped to handle a missing person case involving an American tourist, and language barriers, jurisdictional confusion, and lack of resources meant that critical evidence was lost during the first crucial hours when Amy might still have been recoverable. The Bradleys spent days searching beaches, hotels, bars, and any other location where Amy might have been taken, but they were essentially amateur detectives trying to navigate a foreign country where they didn't speak the language and had no understanding of local criminal networks. During their search on Curaçao, the Bradleys encountered several witnesses whose testimonies would later prove to be crucial pieces of evidence that law enforcement agencies largely ignored. A Canadian tourist named Judy Moorer came forward with a story that would haunt the Bradley family for decades to come, claiming that she had seen Amy in a restroom at a popular Curaçao beach resort where she appeared disheveled, distressed, and desperately trying to communicate something important. According to Moorer, Amy looked directly at her and said, "Please help me get home to Virginia," before 2 men who appeared to be controlling her movements quickly intervened and forced her to leave the restroom. Moorer initially thought this was just a tourist who had had too much to drink, but when she later saw Amy's missing person flyers, she realized she had witnessed something far more sinister and contacted the Bradley family immediately. Another witness, a taxi driver who worked near the cruise ship terminal, reported seeing a young woman matching Amy's description being forcibly placed into a van by several men in the early morning hours of March 24th, shortly after the Rhapsody of the Seas had docked. The woman was reportedly struggling and appeared to be trying to call for help, but the men covered her mouth and quickly drove away toward a part of the island known for its connection to organized crime and prostitution. The most disturbing testimony came from David Carmichael, a U.S. Navy sailor who was stationed in the Caribbean, and had shore leave in Curaçao several months after Amy's disappearance. Carmichael reported that he had visited a brothel in a seedy part of the island, where he encountered a young American woman who immediately grabbed his arm and whispered urgently, "I'm Amy Bradley from Virginia, and I've been kidnapped. Please help me." According to Carmichael, the woman showed him identifying scars and tattoos that matched Amy's physical description perfectly, and she provided specific details about her family and her disappearance from the cruise ship that had never been made public. Before Carmichael could respond or take action, several armed men surrounded them and forced him to leave the establishment immediately, making it clear that any attempt to help the woman would result in serious consequences for both of them. Carmichael initially hesitated to come forward with this information because of the sensitive nature of his military position and the illegal activities he had been engaging in, but his conscience eventually compelled him to contact the Bradley family and provide them with detailed information about the location and circumstances of his encounter with Amy. Perhaps the most chilling evidence in Amy's case emerged several years later when the Bradley family began receiving anonymous emails containing photographs that appeared to show Amy in various states of undress, clearly against her will, with visible bruises, signs of physical abuse, and a look of absolute terror in her eyes that spoke of prolonged trauma and suffering. These images, which were sent from untraceable email accounts, showed a woman who matched Amy's physical characteristics in what appeared to be different locations over several years, suggesting that she was being moved around regularly as part of an organized trafficking operation. The photographs were analyzed by FBI experts and independent forensic specialists who concluded that they could potentially be authentic and showed signs of being taken in various Caribbean and South American locations known for their involvement in the international sex trade. The timing and content of these images suggested that Amy's captors were deliberately taunting her family, possibly as part of a psychological warfare campaign designed to extract money or simply to inflict maximum emotional damage on people who refuse to stop searching for their daughter. What makes Amy's case even more terrifying is the mounting evidence that suggests certain crew members aboard the Rhapsody of the Seas were not innocent bystanders, but active participants in her disappearance, possibly working as scouts or facilitators for human trafficking networks that specifically target cruise ship passengers. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Amy in lengthy conversations with various crew members throughout the cruise, including not just Yellow from the Blue Orchid Band, but also security personnel, cabin stewards, and other staff members who had access to passenger information and ship schedules. These crew members would have known exactly when the ship would dock, which passengers were traveling alone or in vulnerable situations, and how to move around the ship without being detected by security cameras. The fact that security footage conveniently malfunctioned during the crucial hours of Amy's disappearance suggests that this was not a random crime of opportunity, but a carefully planned operation that required inside knowledge and assistance from people who understood the ship's security systems and operational procedures. Royal Caribbean's response to Amy's disappearance has been nothing short of suspicious and potentially criminal in its systematic obstruction of justice and destruction of evidence. Despite repeated legal demands from the Bradley family and pressure from law enforcement agencies, the cruise line has never released security footage from the night Amy disappeared, claiming that technical malfunctions and routine maintenance procedures resulted in the destruction of all relevant recordings. Company representatives have consistently downplayed the possibility that Amy was kidnapped, instead promoting the theory that she fell overboard despite the complete lack of evidence to support this conclusion. More disturbingly, several passengers and crew members who initially provided information about Amy's case later claimed they were contacted by Royal Caribbean representatives and pressured to change their statements or stop cooperating with the investigation entirely. Former crew members have come forward anonymously to report that the cruise line has a standard practice of covering up serious crimes that occur aboard their ships, prioritizing corporate reputation and stock prices over passenger safety and justice for victims. For over 25 years, the Bradley family has transformed their entire lives into a mission to find Amy and bring her home, spending their life savings on private investigators, traveling to dozens of countries following leads, and fighting both the cruise industry and government bureaucracy in their desperate search for answers. Ron and Iva Bradley have appeared on countless television programs, distributed hundreds of thousands of flyers, and maintained a constant online presence designed to keep Amy's case in the public eye and encourage anyone with information to come forward. They have worked with organizations that specialize in finding missing persons and combating human trafficking, learning firsthand about the vast networks of criminals who prey on vulnerable tourists and the shocking inadequacy of international law enforcement cooperation in addressing these crimes. The emotional toll of this endless search has been devastating, with family relationships strained, careers destroyed, and health problems developing from decades of chronic stress and trauma, but the Bradleys have never wavered in their commitment to finding their daughter and bringing her captors to justice. The most horrifying aspect of Amy Bradley's case isn't just that a vibrant young woman vanished without a trace during what should have been a celebration of her achievements, but that she may still be alive somewhere in the dark underworld of international human trafficking, trapped in a nightmare existence where she is systematically abused and exploited by criminals who see her as nothing more than a commodity to be bought, sold, and discarded when she is no longer profitable. Every credible sighting, every anonymous photograph, and every witness testimony suggests that Amy survived her initial kidnapping and has been held captive for decades, possibly moved from country to country as part of a trafficking network that spans multiple continents and involves corrupt officials, criminal organizations, and legitimate businesses that profit from modern slavery. The psychological torture of knowing that their daughter might be alive but unreachable has haunted the Bradley family every single day for over 2 decades, driving them to continue searching even when logic and emotion suggest that hope is futile. Amy Lynn Bradley's disappearance represents everything that is wrong with the cruise ship industry's approach to passenger safety and criminal activity, demonstrating how corporate priorities consistently override basic human decency and justice. Every time you see a glossy cruise ship advertisement promising the vacation of a lifetime, remember Amy Bradley, and remember that behind the carefully marketed luxury amenities and tropical destinations, there are predators who see those ships as floating hunting grounds where vulnerable passengers can disappear forever into a world of unimaginable horror. The vast ocean that surrounds these floating cities ensures that screams for help will never be heard, evidence can be easily destroyed, and witnesses can be silenced or discredited. Amy's case proves that the cruise industry's promise of safety and security is nothing more than a marketing fiction designed to separate trusting families from their money while exposing them to dangers they never imagined possible. Story 2. Carnival Triumph. The Floating Hell. On February 10, 2013, over 4,200 passengers and crew members aboard Carnival Cruise Line's Triumph thought they were embarking on a relaxing 4-day cruise through the Gulf of Mexico, but they were actually about to experience what would become known as the Poop Cruise, a nightmare scenario that would transform their luxury vacation into a real-life Lord of the Flies situation where civilization collapsed and human beings were reduced to their most primal survival instincts. The Carnival Triumph was a massive 893-foot vessel that had been in service since 1999. Marketed as a floating paradise with multiple restaurants, bars, pools, a casino, shopping areas, and entertainment venues designed to provide guests with an unforgettable experience of luxury and relaxation. Passengers had paid thousands of dollars for what they believed would be a safe, clean, and enjoyable escape from their everyday lives, trusting that Carnival's promises of world-class service and safety standards would be fulfilled throughout their journey. The ship was carrying a diverse mix of families celebrating special occasions, couples on romantic getaways, groups of friends seeking adventure, and solo travelers looking for relaxation, all united by their shared expectation that they would be well cared for by a professional crew trained to handle any situation that might arise during their voyage. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came around 3 a.m. on February 10th, when passengers were awakened by a loud bang, followed by the acrid smell of smoke filling the air throughout multiple decks of the ship. What had happened was catastrophic. An engine room fire had broken out in the ship's aft section, caused by a fuel line leak that ignited and quickly spread through critical mechanical systems that controlled the vessel's propulsion, electrical power, and sewage treatment capabilities. The fire suppression systems activated automatically, flooding the engine compartment with CO2 and successfully extinguishing the flames, but the damage had already been done to essential infrastructure that kept the ship functioning as a livable environment for thousands of people. Within hours, the Triumph had lost all main power, leaving the massive vessel dead in the water and drifting helplessly in the Gulf of Mexico, about 150 miles off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, with no propulsion, no air conditioning, no working toilets, and no way to process the enormous amounts of waste generated by over 4,000 people confined in a relatively small space. As the reality of their situation began to sink in, passengers initially maintained a sense of optimism and cooperation, trusting that Carnival's emergency procedures would quickly resolve the crisis and get them back to port within a reasonable time frame. The ship's crew, led by Captain Amerigo Basso, tried to maintain order and keep morale high by assuring passengers that tugboats were already en route to tow them back to civilization. But what they didn't reveal was the true extent of the mechanical failures and the logistical nightmare of moving a powerless 893-foot vessel through open ocean waters. The backup generators that were supposed to maintain essential services proved woefully inadequate for a ship of this size, providing only intermittent power to critical systems while leaving vast sections of the vessel in complete darkness. Without air conditioning in the Gulf of Mexico's humid climate, temperatures inside the ship quickly rose to unbearable levels, turning passenger cabins into sweltering ovens where people could barely breathe, let alone sleep or rest comfortably. The first day after the fire, passengers were still relatively patient and understanding, sharing food, helping elderly and disabled travelers, and trying to make the best of an unfortunate situation. But by the second day, the true horror of their predicament began to emerge as the ship's sewage systems completely failed, and human waste began backing up into passenger cabins, hallways, and public areas. Without functioning toilets, over 4,000 people were forced to relieve themselves in plastic bags, buckets, and eventually anywhere they could find space, creating a biohazard situation that would have been condemned by health authorities if it had occurred on land. The smell became absolutely unbearable, a mixture of human excrement, rotting food, stagnant water, and unwashed bodies that permeated every inch of the ship and made breathing a nauseating ordeal that left passengers constantly on the verge of vomiting. Sewage began flowing down walls and pooling in corridors, creating slip hazards that resulted in injuries as people fell while trying to navigate the increasingly treacherous environment of their floating prison. As the days dragged on, the social fabric of the passenger community began to unravel in ways that revealed the darkest aspects of human nature when civilized norms break down and survival instincts take over. Food became increasingly scarce as the ship's refrigeration systems failed and perishable items spoiled in the tropical heat, leading to competition and conflict over the limited supplies of bread, crackers, and canned goods that remained edible. Fights broke out in the dining areas as hungry passengers struggled over portions that would have seemed ridiculously small under normal circumstances, with some people hoarding food while others went without meals entirely. The ship's crew, who were supposed to maintain order and distribute resources fairly, proved completely unprepared for managing a crisis of this magnitude, often disappearing into restricted areas and leaving passengers to fend for themselves in increasingly desperate circumstances. The psychological breakdown was perhaps even more disturbing than the physical conditions, as people who had been polite, civilized vacationers just days earlier began exhibiting aggressive, antisocial behaviors that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Passengers reported incidents of theft, with people breaking into abandoned cabins to steal bottled water, snacks, and any other valuable resources they could find. There were allegations of sexual assault in the darkened areas of the ship where security was non-existent, and predators could operate without fear of intervention. Elderly passengers and families with young children were particularly vulnerable, often targeted by stronger, more aggressive individuals who saw them as easy sources of hoarded supplies or simply as convenient scapegoats for their own frustration and fear. The lack of communication with the outside world added another layer of psychological torture to an already unbearable situation, as passengers had no reliable information about rescue efforts, expected timelines, or even whether their families knew they were in distress. Cell phone towers were out of range, satellite communications were down, and the ship's public address system worked only sporadically, leaving people to rely on rumors, speculation, and increasingly wild conspiracy theories about what was really happening to them. Some passengers became convinced that they had been deliberately abandoned, either as part of an insurance fraud scheme or because Carnival was more concerned about avoiding negative publicity than actually rescuing them. Others developed paranoid delusions about crew members secretly working against passenger interests, hoarding the best food and water for themselves while letting paying customers suffer in squalor. By the third day, the situation had deteriorated to the point where basic human dignity was impossible to maintain, and passengers were forced to live in conditions that violated every standard of health, safety, and basic humanity that civilized society takes for granted. People were sleeping on deck chairs under the open sky because their cabins had become uninhabitable due to sewage backup, oppressive heat, and the overwhelming stench that made enclosed spaces unbearable. Passengers with medical conditions were suffering without access to proper care, as the ship's medical facility was overwhelmed and lacked the resources to treat people who were becoming sick from dehydration, heat exhaustion, and exposure to unsanitary conditions. Children were crying constantly, not understanding why their parents couldn't make the nightmare stop, while adults struggled to maintain any semblance of hope or rationality in circumstances that seemed designed to break human spirits. The ship's crew members, who should have been trained professionals capable of managing emergency situations, instead proved to be just as helpless and desperate as the passengers they were supposed to serve and protect. Many crew members simply abandoned their posts and retreated to staff-only areas, leaving essential services unmanned and passengers without guidance or assistance during the most critical moments of the crisis. Those who remained on duty were often hostile and uncooperative, treating passenger complaints and requests for help as personal attacks rather than legitimate concerns about basic survival needs. The captain and senior officers were virtually invisible throughout most of the ordeal, communicating with passengers only through occasional announcements that provided no useful information and often contradicted previous statements, creating even more confusion and distrust. As news of the Triumph's plight reached the outside world, the response from Carnival Cruise Lines was a masterclass in corporate damage control that prioritized public relations over passenger welfare, demonstrating how large corporations view their customers as expendable assets rather than human beings deserving of basic care and protection. Company executives initially downplayed the severity of the situation, describing it as a minor mechanical issue that would be resolved quickly, while simultaneously working behind the scenes to craft messaging strategies that would minimize financial liability and reputational damage. When the true extent of the crisis became impossible to hide, Carnival representatives began spinning the story as an unfortunate but manageable situation where passengers were being well cared for by dedicated crew members, a narrative that bore no resemblance to the actual hellish conditions aboard the ship. The rescue operation itself became another source of frustration and suffering, as multiple tugboats struggled for days to tow the powerless vessel through rough seas toward the port of Mobile, Alabama, a journey that should have taken hours but stretched into an agonizing multi-day ordeal that tested the limits of human endurance. Passengers watched helplessly as their floating prison moved at glacial speed across the Gulf of Mexico, knowing that every hour of delay meant more time spent in conditions that would have been considered torture if inflicted deliberately by enemy forces during wartime. The tugboats themselves faced technical difficulties and coordination problems that suggested a shocking lack of preparedness for this type of emergency, despite the cruise industry's claims that comprehensive safety and rescue procedures were in place to handle any conceivable crisis. When the Carnival Triumph finally limped into Mobile on February 14th, Valentine's Day, the passengers who disembarked were traumatized, physically ill, and fundamentally changed by their experience of watching civilization collapse around them in a matter of days. Many described symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares, panic attacks, and an inability to trust confined spaces or cruise ships ever again. Families reported that their children had been psychologically scarred by witnessing adults behave like animals, seeing human waste everywhere, and experiencing the terror of being trapped in a situation where the people responsible for their safety had completely failed to protect them. The physical health consequences were equally severe, with passengers suffering from dehydration, malnutrition, skin infections, respiratory problems, and gastrointestinal issues caused by exposure to unsanitary conditions for extended periods. The legal aftermath of the Carnival Triumph disaster revealed the shocking extent to which cruise lines are protected from accountability by maritime law and corporate legal strategies that essentially make them immune from meaningful consequences for endangering passenger lives. Despite clear evidence of negligent maintenance, inadequate emergency procedures, and complete failure to protect passenger welfare during a crisis, Carnival faced relatively minor financial penalties and was able to continue operating with minimal changes to their safety protocols. The company's legal team successfully argued that passengers had assumed the risk of mechanical failures when they purchased their tickets, and that maritime law limited Carnival's liability to refunding the cost of the cruise, plus a small additional compensation amount that was laughably inadequate given the trauma and suffering that passengers had endured. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the Carnival Triumph incident was not an isolated occurrence but part of a pattern of cruise ship disasters, mechanical failures, and safety violations that demonstrate the industry's systemic disregard for passenger welfare in favor of profit maximization and cost-cutting measures that compromise essential safety systems. In the years following the Triumph disaster, other Carnival ships experienced similar problems with power failures, sewage system breakdowns, and emergency response failures that left thousands of additional passengers stranded in dangerous and unsanitary conditions. The cruise industry's response to these repeated incidents has been to improve their public relations messaging rather than address the underlying safety deficiencies that continue to put passengers at risk every time they board one of these floating death traps. The Carnival Triumph disaster serves as a terrifying reminder that when you step aboard a cruise ship, you are essentially placing your life in the hands of the cruise ship hands of corporations that view passenger safety as an acceptable business expense rather than a moral imperative, and that the luxurious amenities and professional service that define the cruise experience can disappear instantly when mechanical systems fail and reveal the true priorities of the companies that operate these vessels. The 4,200 people who survived the Triumph's nightmarish journey learned firsthand that human civilization is far more fragile than most people realize, and that when the veneer of modern comfort is stripped away, we are all just animals fighting for survival in conditions that can become unlivable faster than anyone wants to imagine. Story 3. Costa Concordia. The Captain's Betrayal. On January the 13th, 2012, Captain Francesco Schettino was commanding the Costa Concordia, a massive 951-foot cruise ship carrying 4,252 passengers and crew members on what was supposed to be a routine Mediterranean cruise. But his reckless decision to perform an unauthorized sail-by salute near the Italian island of Giglio would transform a luxury vacation into one of the most horrific maritime disasters in modern history, where 32 innocent people would lose their lives because one man's arrogance and cowardice proved more powerful than his duty to protect the souls under his command. Captain Schettino was a 52-year-old veteran mariner with over 30 years of experience at sea, but beneath his professional credentials lurked a dangerous combination of ego, recklessness, and fundamental disregard for the safety protocols that exist specifically to prevent the kind of catastrophic disaster he was about to unleash upon thousands of unsuspecting passengers who had trusted him with their lives. The Costa Concordia was one of the largest cruise ships ever built, a floating city that represented the pinnacle of Italian engineering and luxury hospitality, marketed to passengers as an unsinkable fortress of safety and comfort that would provide them with an unforgettable experience of Mediterranean culture, cuisine, and scenic beauty. The evening of January 13th began like countless others aboard the Costa Concordia, with passengers enjoying elegant dinners in multiple restaurants, dancing in various lounges, gambling in the casino, and participating in organized entertainment activities designed to create the perfect atmosphere of relaxation and celebration that cruise lines work so hard to cultivate. Families were spending quality time together, couples were celebrating anniversaries and honeymoons, and groups of friends were creating memories they expected to treasure for the rest of their lives, completely unaware that their captain was about to make a decision that would turn their dream vacation into a nightmare of unimaginable terror and loss. At approximately 9:45 p.m., as most passengers were finishing their dinners and preparing for the evening's entertainment, Captain Schettino made the fateful decision to deviate from the ship's planned route and sail dangerously close to the island of Giglio, ostensibly to perform a sail-by salute for the benefit of passengers and local residents, but actually to show off for a female crew member he was trying to impress and to demonstrate his supposed mastery of seamanship to anyone who might be watching. What Captain Schettino didn't adequately consider, or simply chose to ignore in his arrogance, was that the waters around Giglio contained numerous underwater rock formations and shallow areas that posed serious navigational hazards to large vessels, especially when approached at night without proper preparation, planning, or adherence to established safety protocols that existed specifically to prevent ships from running aground in dangerous waters. The island's coastline was well known to experienced mariners as treacherous and unforgiving, with jagged rocks lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to tear open the hull of any vessel that ventured too close without extreme caution and precise navigation. Professional maritime protocols required ships to maintain safe distances from such hazardous coastlines, but Schettino's ego and desire to create a spectacular show for his passengers overrode decades of established safety practices and international maritime law that existed to protect both vessels and the people aboard them. At 9:45 p.m., as the Costa Concordia approached the island at a speed that was far too fast for safe maneuvering in such dangerous waters, the ship's hull struck a submerged rock formation called Le Scole, creating a massive 174-foot gash that immediately began flooding multiple compartments and compromising the vessel's structural integrity in ways that would prove impossible to control or repair. The impact was so violent that passengers throughout the ship felt the collision as a grinding, scraping sensation accompanied by a loud metallic tearing sound that many later described as the most terrifying noise they had ever heard, like the screams of a dying metal giant being tortured by forces beyond its ability to withstand. Within minutes, the ship began listing dramatically to starboard as thousands of tons of seawater poured through the massive breach in the hull, creating a chaotic environment where passengers struggled to maintain their footing on increasingly tilted floors while trying to understand what was happening to them and whether they were in immediate mortal danger. Rather than immediately implementing emergency procedures, sounding the general alarm, and beginning an orderly evacuation that might have saved more lives, Captain Schettino spent precious minutes trying to downplay the severity of the situation, apparently more concerned about his career prospects and potential legal consequences than about the safety of the thousands of people whose lives depended on his leadership and competence during this critical moment. The ship's crew received conflicting and inadequate instructions from the bridge, leading to confusion and delays that would prove fatal for many passengers who might have survived if proper emergency procedures had been implemented immediately after the collision. Schettino's initial response was to order the ship to continue toward port, apparently hoping that he could somehow minimize the disaster and avoid the professional and legal consequences of his reckless navigation. But the flooding was too severe, and the damage too extensive for any such hope to be realistic. As the Costa Concordia continued to take on water and list more severely, passengers began to panic as they realized that this was not a minor mechanical issue that would be quickly resolved, but a genuine, life-threatening emergency that required immediate evacuation from a ship that was clearly sinking and might capsize at any moment. The general alarm was not sounded until 10:58 p.m., over an hour after the initial collision, and even then, many passengers received inadequate or contradictory information about what they should do to protect themselves and their families. The delay in implementing proper emergency procedures meant that passengers lost critical time that could have been used for orderly evacuation, instead wasting precious minutes in confusion and uncertainty, while the ship's condition continued to deteriorate and their chances of survival diminished with each passing moment. The evacuation process itself became a horrific demonstration of how quickly civilized behavior can break down when people realize they are fighting for their lives in a situation where there may not be enough lifeboats, life jackets, or rescue opportunities for everyone who needs them. Passengers reported scenes of absolute chaos as people pushed, shoved, and trampled each other in desperate attempts to reach lifeboats and muster stations, with the ship's severe listing making movement extremely difficult and dangerous as people slipped and fell on wet, tilted decks. Many passengers, particularly elderly individuals and those with mobility issues, were unable to navigate the increasingly treacherous environment of the sinking ship and became trapped in areas where they could not reach evacuation routes or receive adequate assistance from crew members who were supposed to help them, but instead seemed more concerned about saving themselves. The crew's response to the emergency was marked by incompetence, cowardice, and a complete breakdown of the professional standards that passengers had every right to expect from trained maritime professionals who were supposed to prioritize passenger safety above all other considerations. Many crew members abandoned their posts and responsibilities, leaving passengers to fend for themselves without proper guidance or assistance, while others provided conflicting information that increased confusion and panic rather than helping people evacuate safely and efficiently. The crew's training and preparedness for emergency situations proved woefully inadequate for managing a disaster of this magnitude, with many staff members appearing to be just as confused and frightened as the passengers they were supposed to be leading to safety. But the most shocking and unforgivable aspect of the Costa Concordia disaster was Captain Schettino's decision to abandon ship while passengers and crew members were still trapped aboard the sinking vessel, violating one of the most fundamental principles of maritime command and demonstrating a level of cowardice that would make him an international symbol of professional failure and moral bankruptcy. While people were still dying aboard his ship, Schettino climbed into a lifeboat and left for shore, later claiming that he had fallen into the lifeboat accidentally and couldn't get back to his ship, a lie so transparent and ridiculous that it became the subject of worldwide mockery and condemnation. His abandonment of the ship was captured in a recorded phone conversation with the Italian Coast Guard, where Captain Gregorio De Falco repeatedly ordered Schettino to return to his ship and coordinate rescue efforts, famously shouting, "Vada a bordo, cazzo! Get back on board, damn it!" when Schettino tried to make excuses for his cowardly behavior. The human cost of Schettino's recklessness and cowardice was devastating, with 32 people losing their lives in a disaster that was entirely preventable and resulted directly from one man's decision to prioritize his ego over the safety of everyone under his command. Among the victims were couples celebrating special occasions, families on vacation, crew members trying to help passengers, and individuals who had simply made the mistake of trusting that their cruise ship captain would prioritize their safety above his own convenience and vanity. Each of these deaths represented not just a statistical casualty but a complete life with hopes, dreams, relationships, and contributions to their communities that were cut short because Francesco Schettino decided that performing an unauthorized show-off maneuver was more important than following established safety protocols. The psychological trauma inflicted on survivors was equally severe, with many passengers reporting long-term effects including nightmares, panic attacks, survivor's guilt, and an inability to trust maritime transportation or enclosed spaces ever again. Children who witnessed the chaos and terror of the evacuation were particularly affected, with many requiring years of therapy to process the experience of seeing adults panic, watching people fall and get trampled, and realizing that the authorities they had been taught to trust could fail them so completely when their lives depended on competent leadership. Families were separated during the evacuation process, spending hours not knowing whether their loved ones had survived, and many survivors reported feeling abandoned and betrayed by the crew members who were supposed to protect them, but instead fled for their own safety. The legal aftermath of the Costa Concordia disaster revealed the shocking extent to which individual negligence and recklessness can have catastrophic consequences for thousands of innocent people, while also demonstrating how difficult it can be to hold maritime professionals accountable for their failures, even when those failures result in multiple deaths and devastating trauma. Captain Schettino was eventually convicted of manslaughter, causing a maritime disaster and abandoning ship, receiving a 16-year prison sentence that many felt was inadequate given the magnitude of his crimes and the number of lives lost due to his reckless decision-making. Costa Cruises, the company that operated the ship, faced significant financial penalties and reputational damage, but continued operating with minimal changes to their safety protocols and captain training programs, suggesting that the lessons of the disaster were not adequately learned or implemented across the industry. The Costa Concordia disaster also exposed serious flaws in international maritime safety regulations and enforcement mechanisms, revealing how cruise lines can operate with minimal oversight and inadequate consequences for safety violations that put passenger lives at risk. The investigation revealed that the ship's crew had not conducted proper safety drills, that emergency equipment was not properly maintained or accessible, and that communication systems failed when they were needed most. But these systemic problems were largely overshadowed by focus on Captain Schettino's individual failures, rather than the broader industry issues that allowed such failures to have such catastrophic consequences. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the Costa Concordia disaster was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of cruise ship accidents, safety violations, and emergency response failures that demonstrate the maritime industry's systemic problems with prioritizing profit over passenger safety and maintaining adequate professional standards among the crew members responsible for protecting thousands of lives during each voyage. The disaster serves as a terrifying reminder that when you board a cruise ship, you are placing your life in the hands of individuals whose competence, training, and moral character may be completely inadequate for the enormous responsibility they have accepted, and that the consequences of their failures can be swift, catastrophic, and irreversible. Every passenger who steps aboard a cruise ship should remember Francesco Schettino and ask themselves whether they truly trust that their captain would prioritize their safety over his own ego, convenience, or self-preservation when faced with a crisis that tests his character and competence under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Story 4. The Murder of Dianne Brimble. Death by Betrayal. On September 23, 2002, 42-year-old Dianne Brimble boarded the P&O cruise ship Pacific Sky in Sydney, Australia, excited to celebrate her daughter's upcoming wedding with what she thought would be a relaxing 4-day cruise to Vanuatu, but instead she would become the victim of one of the most horrific crimes ever committed aboard a passenger vessel, where a group of predatory men would drug, sexually assault, and ultimately kill her in a crime so brutal and depraved that it would expose the dark underbelly of cruise ship culture and the systematic cover-ups that protect criminals while silencing their victims. Dianne was a devoted mother of 3 from Brisbane, who worked as a customer service representative and had been looking forward to this cruise as a rare opportunity to spend quality time with her daughter Talia and create happy memories before the upcoming wedding celebration that was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter in their family's life. She was described by everyone who knew her as a kind, trusting, and generous woman, who always saw the best in people and would never have imagined that her fellow passengers might view her as prey to be hunted, drugged, and destroyed for their own sick entertainment and sexual gratification. The Pacific Sky was marketed as a family-friendly cruise ship that provided safe, wholesome entertainment for passengers of all ages. But what P&O didn't advertise was that their vessels had become floating playgrounds for groups of predatory men who specifically booked cruises to target vulnerable women, often working together in coordinated attacks that involved drugging victims with substances like gamma-hydroxybutyric acid, commonly known as the date rape drug, which renders victims unconscious and unable to resist sexual assault while leaving them with little or no memory of what was done to them. These predators had learned that cruise ships provided the perfect environment for their crimes because victims were isolated from law enforcement, security was minimal and often complicit, and the ship's medical staff could be counted on to cover up evidence of sexual assault, rather than properly investigate and report crimes that might damage the cruise line's reputation and profitability. On the first night of the cruise, Dianne was enjoying herself at one of the ship's bars when she was approached by a group of 8 men from Sydney, who were traveling together and had apparently been watching her throughout the evening, assessing her as a potential target for their planned assault. These men, who ranged in age from their 20s to their 40s, included Mark Wilhelm, Ryan Kukul, Letterio Silvestri, Matthew Slade, Charlie Camboris, Leo Silvestri, Dragan Losic, and Peter Pantic, all of whom would later be implicated in the events that led to Dianne's death, though the Australian justice system would ultimately fail to hold most of them accountable for their crimes. The group had been drinking heavily and using illegal drugs throughout the cruise, creating an atmosphere of toxic masculinity and criminal behavior that escalated when they decided to target Dianne for what they apparently viewed as their entertainment and sexual gratification. What happened next remains partially unclear because the perpetrators have never provided truthful accounts of their actions, but evidence suggests that one or more of these men slipped a powerful drug into Dianne's drink, causing her to become disoriented, confused, and unable to properly consent to any activity or defend herself against what was about to happen to her. Witnesses later reported seeing Dianne in an obviously compromised state, stumbling and appearing to be barely conscious as she was led away from the public areas of the ship by members of this group, who were clearly taking advantage of her drugged condition to isolate her from potential help or witnesses who might have intervened if they had understood what was happening. The men brought Dianne to cabin 8262, which was occupied by Wilhelm and Kukul, where they proceeded to sexually assault her while she was unconscious or semi-conscious from the drugs they had administered without her knowledge or consent. The exact details of what occurred in that cabin may never be fully known because the perpetrators destroyed evidence and lied to investigators, but forensic evidence and witness testimony suggest that Dianne was subjected to a prolonged and brutal gang rape that continued for hours while she was unable to resist or call for help. During this assault, the men also administered additional drugs to keep her unconscious and compliant, including a dangerous combination of substances that would ultimately prove fatal when combined with her existing medical conditions and the trauma of the sexual assault she was enduring. At some point during the night, Dianne stopped breathing, apparently succumbing to the combination of drugs, physical trauma, and the stress of the assault, but rather than immediately seeking medical attention or reporting her death to ship authorities, the perpetrators spent hours trying to cover up their crimes and dispose of evidence that might connect them to her murder. They cleaned the cabin, disposed of drug paraphernalia, coordinated their stories to avoid contradictions, and even attempted to make it appear that Dianne had died from natural causes or accidental overdose rather than as the result of their deliberate criminal actions. This cover-up continued for hours while Dianne's family searched the ship looking for her, increasingly frantic as they realized she was missing and had not returned to her own cabin or appeared at any of her planned activities. When the men finally reported Dianne's death to ship security, they claimed that she had voluntarily come to their cabin, consumed drugs of her own accord, and died accidentally without any involvement or wrongdoing on their part, a lie that was immediately suspicious to anyone familiar with Dianne's character and background, as she was not known to use illegal drugs and would never have voluntarily placed herself in such a dangerous situation with strangers. However, the ship's security personnel and medical staff seemed more interested in accepting this convenient explanation than in conducting a proper investigation that might reveal the true circumstances of her death and the crimes that had been committed against her. The ship's medical examiner, who should have been trained to recognize signs of sexual assault and drug-related homicide, instead performed a cursory examination that failed to properly document evidence of the assault or collect crucial forensic materials that could have been used to prosecute the perpetrators. This failure to properly investigate was not accidental, but part of a systematic pattern of cruise line cover-ups designed to protect the company's reputation and avoid the negative publicity that would result from acknowledging that passengers had been murdered aboard their vessels by other passengers who were allowed to operate without adequate supervision or intervention from security personnel. The men responsible for Dianne's death were allowed to continue their cruise as if nothing had happened, enjoying the remaining days of their vacation while Dianne's family grieved and demanded answers that would never come from the cruise line or the ship's crew. They participated in ship activities, ate at restaurants, and celebrated their successful cover-up while Dianne's body was stored in the ship's morgue, treated like cargo rather than the remains of a human being who had been brutally murdered by predators who viewed her as disposable entertainment. When the ship returned to Sydney, Australian authorities began what should have been a comprehensive investigation into Dianne's death, but they encountered systematic obstruction from P&O Cruises and a conspiracy of silence from the perpetrators that would ultimately prevent justice from being served and allow most of the men responsible for her death to escape meaningful punishment for their crimes. The cruise line's lawyers and corporate executives worked tirelessly to minimize their liability and avoid admissions of wrongdoing that might expose them to lawsuits from Dianne's family or regulatory action from government authorities who might demand changes to their inadequate security and safety procedures. The legal proceedings that followed Dianne's death would drag on for over a decade, becoming a nightmare of bureaucratic incompetence, prosecutorial failures, and judicial decisions that prioritized the rights of accused criminals over justice for the victim and her grieving family. Only one man, Mark Wilhelm, was ultimately convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to a prison term that many felt was inadequate given the brutality of the crime and the number of people involved in both the assault and the subsequent cover-up. The other 7 men escaped serious consequences for their involvement, either through plea deals, prosecutorial decisions not to pursue charges, or legal technicalities that allowed them to avoid accountability for their roles in Dianne's death. The coronial inquest that was supposed to determine the exact cause and circumstances of Dianne's death became another exercise in frustration for her family. As witnesses lied under oath, evidence mysteriously disappeared, and the cruise line's representatives consistently obstructed efforts to uncover the truth about what had happened to her. The final findings were sanitized and inadequate, failing to properly assign responsibility for the systematic failures that had allowed Dianne to be murdered and her killers to escape justice, while also failing to recommend meaningful changes that might prevent similar crimes from occurring aboard other cruise ships in the future. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the investigation revealed that P&O Cruises and other cruise lines were well aware that their vessels had become hunting grounds for sexual predators who specifically targeted vulnerable female passengers, but rather than implementing proper security measures, staff training, or prosecution policies, they chose to cover up these crimes to protect their corporate interests and maintain the illusion that cruise ships were safe environments for solo travelers and trusting families. The cruise industry's response to Dianne's death was not to improve passenger safety, but to improve their public relations strategies and legal defense capabilities to better handle future incidents without admitting wrongdoing or changing their fundamental business practices. The psychological impact on Dianne's family was devastating and permanent, with her children forced to live with the knowledge that their mother had been brutally murdered by predators who faced minimal consequences for their crimes, while the cruise line that failed to protect her continued to operate profitably and market their ships to other unsuspecting families who had no idea about the dangers they might face aboard these floating cities of crime. Talia Brimble, whose wedding celebration had been the reason for the cruise, was forced to cancel her wedding plans and has spent decades fighting for justice for her mother, becoming an advocate for cruise ship safety reforms and victims' rights in an industry that consistently prioritizes profit over human life and dignity. Dianne Brimble's murder represents everything that is wrong with the cruise ship industry's approach to passenger safety, sexual assault, and criminal justice, demonstrating how these floating cities operate as lawless environments where predators can hunt with impunity, while cruise lines systematically cover up their crimes to protect corporate interests. Every woman who considers taking a cruise ship vacation should remember Dianne Brimble and understand that the smiling crew members, luxury amenities, and promises of safe family fun are often nothing more than marketing facades that conceal an industry built on exploitation, cover-ups, and the systematic victimization of vulnerable passengers who trust that they will be protected while traveling in international waters where normal law enforcement cannot reach them. The men who killed Dianne Brimble are still walking free today, having faced minimal consequences for their crimes and continuing to live their lives while her family grieves and fights for the justice that the Australian legal system and cruise industry have consistently denied them. This case proves that when you step aboard a cruise ship, you are entering an environment where criminals can operate with near-total impunity, where evidence of serious crimes can be destroyed or covered up, and where your life and safety matter far less than corporate profits and the maintenance of an industry that profits from putting vulnerable people in dangerous situations while lying about the risks they face. Story 5. The Grandfather's Fatal Drop. A Family's Darkest Secret. On July 7, 2019, 51-year-old Salvatore Anello boarded Royal Caribbean's Freedom of the Seas cruise ship in San Juan, Puerto Rico, with his extended family for what was supposed to be a joyful vacation celebrating his son's birthday, but instead he would become the perpetrator of one of the most shocking and heartbreaking incidents in cruise ship history when he deliberately or recklessly dropped his 18-month-old granddaughter, Chloe Wiegand, from an 11th floor window, sending the innocent toddler plummeting 150 feet to her death on the concrete dock below, while her horrified family watched in disbelief, and the entire cruise industry scrambled to cover up the disturbing truth about what really happened in those final, terrible moments of a child's life. Salvatore Anello was a grandfather from Valparaiso, Indiana, who had been looking forward to spending quality time with his beloved granddaughter during the family cruise. But his actions on that tragic day would destroy not only Chloe's life, but the lives of everyone who loved her, while raising disturbing questions about his mental state, his relationship with alcohol, and the true circumstances that led him to make the decision that would haunt him and his family for the rest of their lives. The Freedom of the Seas was a massive 1,112-foot cruise ship that carried over 4,500 passengers and crew members, marketed as a family-friendly vessel with numerous activities and amenities designed specifically for children and their parents who wanted to create lasting memories during their vacation experience. The ship featured multiple pools, water slides, restaurants, entertainment venues, and observation areas where families could enjoy spectacular ocean views while maintaining complete safety through properly designed barriers, railings, and security measures that were supposed to prevent exactly the kind of accident that would claim Chloe's life. The 11th floor observation deck where the incident occurred was specifically designed as a family area, where parents and grandparents could safely enjoy time with their children while watching the ship's activities and taking in the scenic views of the Caribbean waters and tropical ports of call. On the morning of July 7th, the ship was docked in San Juan, and many passengers were either exploring the historic city or enjoying the ship's amenities while remaining aboard during their port visit. Salvatore Anello had been spending time with his granddaughter Chloe in various areas of the ship, and, according to his own statements, he had been drinking alcohol throughout the morning, though the exact amount and timing of his consumption would become crucial factors in understanding how and why the tragedy occurred. Witnesses later reported seeing Anello appearing intoxicated and behaving erratically in the hours before the incident, raising questions about whether he should have been supervising a young child in his impaired condition and whether other family members should have intervened to ensure Chloe's safety. The events leading up to Chloe's death began when Anello decided to take his granddaughter to the children's water area on the 11th floor, where there were large glass windows that provided panoramic views of the ocean and the port below. According to Anello's initial statements to authorities, he placed Chloe on a wooden railing near one of these windows so she could get a better view and potentially see through what he thought was a closed glass window, but security footage would later reveal a far more disturbing and inexplicable sequence of events that contradicted his version of the story and suggested that his actions were either criminally negligent or deliberately harmful to the child he was supposed to be protecting. The security footage, which was captured by multiple cameras throughout the area, showed Anello approaching the window area with Chloe in his arms, but rather than placing her safely on a secure surface or holding her while they both looked through a closed window, the video revealed that he actually leaned out of an open window, extended his body and arms outside the ship's protective barriers, and then either dropped or released Chloe into the empty airspace that separated the ship from the concrete dock 150 feet below. The footage was so clear and disturbing that investigators, prosecutors, and anyone who viewed it were left with no doubt that Anello's actions were the direct and immediate cause of his granddaughter's death, regardless of his subsequent claims about confusion, accidents, or misunderstanding the window's configuration. What made the incident even more horrifying was that Anello had to have known the window was open because he physically leaned his own body through the opening before extending Chloe outside the ship's protective boundaries, meaning that his claim about thinking the window was closed was demonstrably false based on the physical evidence of his own actions leading up to the moment he released his granddaughter into the void. The security footage showed that Anello held Chloe outside the window for several seconds before letting go, giving him ample time to recognize the danger and pull her back to safety. But instead, he chose to release his grip and allow her to fall to her death, while her family members in other parts of the ship remained unaware that their precious child was about to be murdered by the person they had trusted most to keep her safe. The immediate aftermath of Chloe's death was chaotic and traumatic, with her parents and other family members initially unaware of what had happened until they were informed by ship security that there had been a terrible accident involving their daughter. The family's grief and shock were compounded by Anello's immediate attempts to construct a false narrative about the incident, claiming that he had been confused about whether the window was open or closed, and that Chloe's death was a tragic accident rather than the result of his own inexplicable decision to place her in mortal danger. His lies and manipulations added another layer of trauma to a family that was already devastated by the loss of their child, forcing them to grapple not only with their grief, but also with the disturbing realization that the person they had trusted with Chloe's life had been the one responsible for ending it. Royal Caribbean's response to the incident was swift and focused primarily on protecting the company's legal and financial interests, rather than supporting the grieving family or conducting a thorough investigation into how such a tragedy could have occurred aboard one of their vessels. The cruise line's lawyers immediately began crafting a defense strategy that would minimize the company's liability while shifting all responsibility to Anello, Despite the fact that their ship's design, safety measures, and supervision policies had clearly failed to prevent a grandfather from murdering his granddaughter in full view of security cameras and potential witnesses who could have intervened if proper protocols had been in place. The legal proceedings that followed Chloe's death became a complex and emotionally devastating battle between multiple parties who each had different versions of the truth and different interests in the outcome of the case. Anello was charged with negligent homicide by Puerto Rican authorities, who had jurisdiction over the case because the incident occurred while the ship was docked in San Juan, but his defense team immediately began constructing an elaborate narrative designed to portray him as a loving grandfather who had made an innocent mistake, rather than someone whose actions had directly caused his granddaughter's death. The family initially supported Anello's version of events, either because they couldn't bear to believe that he had deliberately harmed Chloe, or because they were being manipulated by lawyers and other advisors who convinced them that supporting his story was in their best interests. However, as more evidence emerged, including the security footage that clearly showed Anello's actions in the moments leading up to Chloe's death, the family's support for his version of events began to waver, and some family members started questioning whether they had been lied to about what really happened to their daughter and granddaughter. The security footage was so damning and undeniable that it became impossible for anyone viewing it to accept Anello's claims about confusion or accidental circumstances, leading to growing suspicion that his actions had been either criminally negligent or deliberately harmful, regardless of his motives or mental state at the time. The family's decision to file a lawsuit against Royal Caribbean, claiming that the cruise line was responsible for Chloe's death due to inadequate safety measures and dangerous ship design, created additional complications and contradictions in their narrative about what had happened and who was ultimately responsible for the tragedy. Their lawsuit claimed that the open window represented a dangerous condition that the cruise line should have anticipated and prevented. But this argument was undermined by the security footage showing that Anello had to physically lean through the opening and extend his arms outside the ship's protective barriers in order to place Chloe in the position where she would fall to her death. The psychological impact of Chloe's death on her parents, siblings, and extended family members has been devastating and permanent, with many family members requiring extensive therapy and counseling to process not only their grief over losing her, but also their trauma from learning that someone they trusted and loved had been responsible for ending her life. The family has been torn apart by conflicting loyalties, legal strategies, and the impossible task of trying to make sense of an incident that defies rational explanation or acceptance, while also dealing with intense media scrutiny and public judgment about their decision to support or condemn Anello's actions. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the case has revealed how easily families can be manipulated and divided when faced with unthinkable tragedies, and how legal and financial considerations can override truth, justice, and accountability, even in cases involving the death of an innocent child. The family's initial decision to support Anello's false narrative, followed by their lawsuit against Royal Caribbean, created a complex web of contradictions and conflicting interests that made it difficult for authorities to pursue justice for Chloe while also providing Anello with legal cover for his actions. The broader implications of Chloe's death extend far beyond the specific circumstances of her case, raising disturbing questions about cruise ship safety, family dynamics, alcohol policies, child supervision requirements, and the cruise industry's responsibility to protect its most vulnerable passengers from harm by other passengers, including family members who may pose unexpected dangers. The incident demonstrates how quickly a family vacation can turn into an unthinkable nightmare when adults fail to properly supervise children or make decisions that put innocent lives at risk, and how the cruise industry's focus on profit and liability protection can override their moral obligation to ensure passenger safety and support families during times of crisis. Salvatore Anello ultimately pleaded guilty to negligent homicide and received a sentence of 3 years probation, a punishment that many felt was grossly inadequate given that his actions had directly resulted in the death of an 18-month-old child who had trusted him to keep her safe. His relatively light sentence reflected the complex legal and emotional factors surrounding the case, but it also sent a disturbing message about the value placed on children's lives and the consequences faced by adults who fail in their most basic responsibility to protect the innocent and vulnerable members of their families. The tragedy of Chloe Wiegand serves as a horrifying reminder that the greatest dangers facing children and families on cruise ships may not come from external threats like accidents, mechanical failures, or criminal strangers, but from the people they trust most and the poor decisions that can be made in moments of impaired judgment, emotional instability, or inexplicable malice. Every parent and grandparent who considers taking their children on a cruise vacation should remember Chloe Wiegand and understand that their most important responsibility is not to create perfect memories or capture ideal photographs, but to ensure that the children in their care remain safe and protected from all potential dangers, including the ones that exist within their own family circles and their own impaired decision-making capabilities. Story 6. The Lyubov Orlova, Ghost Ship of the Atlantic. In January 2013, the abandoned cruise ship Lyubov Orlova broke free from its tugboat tow line during a fierce North Atlantic storm and began drifting unmanned across the treacherous waters between Canada and Europe, transforming from a derelict vessel into something far more terrifying, a floating ghost ship potentially infested with thousands of disease-carrying rats that had been trapped aboard for months, growing increasingly desperate, aggressive, and potentially cannibalistic as their food supplies dwindled and their numbers either exploded through unchecked breeding or collapsed through starvation and violence. The Lyubov Orlova was originally built in Yugoslavia in 1976 as a luxury cruise ship designed to carry passengers through the pristine wilderness of Antarctica and the Arctic, marketed as an adventure vessel that would provide wealthy tourists with once-in-a-lifetime experiences exploring some of the most remote and beautiful locations on Earth. But by 2010, the ship had been abandoned in St. John's, Newfoundland, after its Russian owners defaulted on millions of dollars in debts, leaving the vessel to rot at the dock while legal battles raged over its ownership and the responsibility for its disposal. For over 2 years, the Lyubov Orlova sat abandoned at the Canadian dock, slowly deteriorating as weather, vandals, and scavengers stripped away anything of value, while the ship's hull, mechanical systems, and interior spaces became increasingly uninhabitable and potentially dangerous to anyone who might venture aboard the derelict vessel. During this period of abandonment, the ship became home to a thriving population of rats that had originally come aboard as stowaways during the vessel's final voyages, but had now established a complex ecosystem within the ship's maze-like interior, feeding on whatever organic materials they could find and reproducing at an alarming rate that would eventually create a floating nightmare of unprecedented proportions. These rats, initially numbering in the dozens or hundreds, had no natural predators aboard the ship and unlimited access to hiding places, nesting areas, and whatever food sources they could locate in the ship's kitchens, storage areas, and passenger quarters, creating ideal conditions for population growth that could potentially result in thousands of rodents living within the vessel's hull. The Canadian government, desperate to rid themselves of the legal and financial burden of the abandoned ship, finally arranged for the Lyubov Orlova to be towed out to international waters and scrapped. But this decision would prove to be one of the most catastrophically short-sighted environmental and public safety decisions in modern maritime history, as it essentially released a floating biological weapon into the North Atlantic shipping lanes where it could pose dangers to commercial vessels, fishing boats, and coastal communities throughout the region. On January 23, 2013, the tugboat Charlene Hunt began towing the Lyubov Orlova away from St. John's Harbor, but the tow line snapped during rough weather approximately 1,200 nautical miles off the coast of Newfoundland, leaving the ghost ship to drift freely through some of the busiest shipping lanes in the world while carrying its cargo of potentially diseased and increasingly desperate rats who had now been trapped aboard for years without adequate food or fresh water. The immediate response to the ship's escape was characterized by bureaucratic confusion, jurisdictional disputes, and a shocking lack of urgency considering the potential dangers posed by an unmanned vessel drifting through international shipping lanes during winter storm season when visibility was poor and collision risks were highest. Canadian authorities initially attempted to downplay the situation, suggesting that the ship would either sink naturally or drift harmlessly away from populated areas. But maritime safety experts immediately recognized that a 4,200-ton steel vessel could remain afloat for months or even years, while posing collision risks to other ships and potentially washing ashore in populated areas where its rat population could spread. Diseases contaminate food supplies and establish breeding colonies that would be extremely difficult to eradicate. As weeks turned into months with no confirmed sightings of the drifting ghost ship, maritime authorities, environmental agencies, and public health officials throughout the North Atlantic region began to realize that they were facing an unprecedented crisis with no clear protocols, legal frameworks, or technical solutions for dealing with a vessel that had essentially become a floating biological hazard drifting unpredictably through international waters. The rats aboard the Lyubov Orlova, initially sustained by whatever food stores remained in the ship's pantries and storage areas, would have quickly exhausted these resources and been forced to turn to increasingly desperate survival strategies, including eating the ship's insulation, wood furnishings, fabric materials, and potentially each other as starvation set in, and their population either collapsed through mass death or adapted to cannibalistic behaviors that would create even more aggressive and disease-prone survivors. Marine biologists and disease experts who studied the situation concluded that the rats aboard the Lyubov Orlova were likely experiencing extreme stress, malnutrition, and overcrowding that would make them far more aggressive and dangerous than typical ship rats, potentially carrying enhanced strains of diseases like plague, typhus, hantavirus, and other pathogens that could pose serious threats to human populations if the ship ever made landfall or came into contact with other vessels. The closed environment of the ship, combined with years of isolation and inbreeding, could have created ideal conditions for the development and concentration of dangerous disease strains that would be particularly virulent and difficult to treat if they spread to human populations through rat bites, contaminated food supplies, or airborne transmission from infected carcasses. The psychological horror of the Lyubov Orlova's situation was amplified by the complete uncertainty surrounding the ship's location, condition, and the state of its rat population after months of drifting through the harsh North Atlantic environment where winter storms, freezing temperatures, and massive waves would have created hellish conditions aboard the unmanned vessel. Maritime tracking systems occasionally detected signals that might have come from the ship's emergency beacons, but these sightings were never confirmed, leading to speculation that the Lyubov Orlova was playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek with authorities while continuing to drift toward populated coastlines where its arrival could trigger public health emergencies and environmental disasters. Commercial fishing vessels and cargo ships operating in the North Atlantic were warned to watch for the ghost ship and report any sightings to maritime authorities. But the vastness of the ocean and the ship's dark, unlighted condition made detection extremely difficult, especially during the winter months when storms and poor visibility dominated the region. Crew members on ships that reported possible sightings described an eerie sense of dread when they thought they might be approaching the Lyubov Orlova, knowing that the vessel could be carrying thousands of diseased, starving, and potentially cannibalistic rats that could pose contamination risks even from a distance if the wind carried airborne pathogens from the ship's interior. The international legal implications of the drifting ghost ship created additional complications, as no single government wanted to take responsibility for intercepting, boarding, or disposing of a vessel that could expose their personnel to dangerous diseases while also requiring expensive and technically challenging operations to safely contain and destroy both the ship and its biological cargo. Environmental groups condemned the Canadian government's decision to release the ship into international waters, arguing that it represented a form of environmental terrorism that could have devastating consequences for marine ecosystems, coastal communities, and international shipping if the rats ever reached populated areas or contaminated other vessels. As months passed without definitive sightings or recovery of the Lyubov Orlova, speculation grew about the ship's fate and the condition of its rat population, with some experts suggesting that the harsh Atlantic environment might have killed all the rodents through cold, starvation, or drowning if the ship had taken on water, while others warned that rats are incredibly resilient survivors who could potentially adapt to even the most extreme conditions, and emerge from their floating prison even more dangerous than when they entered it. The possibility that the ship might have sunk was considered preferable to the alternative scenarios where it could still be drifting somewhere in the Atlantic, carried by currents toward the coasts of Europe, Africa, or even back toward North America, where its eventual landfall could trigger public health crises and environmental disasters. Maritime insurance companies began factoring the ghost ship into their risk assessments, recognizing that a collision with the unmanned Lyubov Orlova could result in catastrophic damage to commercial vessels, environmental contamination from fuel spills, and potential disease transmission to crew members who might come into contact with the ship's rat population during rescue or salvage operations. The Lloyd's of London insurance market issued warnings to shipping companies operating in the North Atlantic, advising them to maintain enhanced lookout procedures and emergency response protocols in case they encountered the drifting vessel under conditions where collision or boarding might be unavoidable. The horror of the Lyubov Orlova situation was not just the immediate danger posed by the drifting ship and its diseased rat cargo, but the broader implications for maritime safety, environmental protection, and international cooperation in addressing transnational threats that cross multiple jurisdictions and challenge existing legal frameworks. The incident demonstrated how easily abandoned vessels can become environmental weapons that pose dangers far beyond their original size and scope, especially when they carry biological hazards that can multiply, evolve, and spread in ways that are impossible to predict or control once they are released into the marine environment. Environmental scientists who studied the case concluded that the Lyubov Orlova represented a new category of maritime threat, the biological ghost ship, where abandoned vessels become floating incubators for dangerous organisms that can pose threats to marine ecosystems, human health, and economic activity across vast oceanic regions. The precedent established by allowing the ship to drift freely through international waters raised disturbing questions about how governments and international organizations would handle similar situations in the future, and whether adequate protocols exist for dealing with vessels that become biological hazards through abandonment, neglect, or deliberate release. The ultimate fate of the Lyubov Orlova remains unknown, with some authorities claiming that the ship likely sank in the harsh North Atlantic environment, while others maintain that it could still be drifting somewhere in the world's oceans, carrying its cargo of potentially diseased rats toward an unknown destination, where their eventual landfall could trigger public health emergencies that would make the original cruise ship abandonment seem trivial by comparison. The psychological impact of this uncertainty continues to haunt maritime professionals, environmental scientists, and public health officials who understand that the ghost ship could still be out there, drifting silently through the darkness with its cargo of biological horror, waiting for the moment when it will finally complete its journey and deliver its deadly passengers to whatever coastline has the misfortune to become their final destination. The legacy of the Lyubov Orlova serves as a terrifying reminder that in our interconnected world, environmental irresponsibility and bureaucratic negligence can create threats that transcend national boundaries and challenge our ability to protect human health, marine ecosystems, and international commerce from dangers that we create through our own short-sightedness and failure to properly dispose of the industrial waste and abandoned infrastructure that are the inevitable byproducts of modern civilization. Every abandoned ship, every derelict structure, and every neglected environmental hazard has the potential to become tomorrow's Lyubov Orlova, drifting through our shared spaces and carrying unknown dangers toward destinations where their eventual arrival could trigger catastrophes that we are unprepared to handle or control. Story 7. The Norovirus Nightmare. When Paradise Becomes a Plague Ship. In early 2019, what began as isolated cases of stomach illness aboard multiple cruise ships quickly escalated into one of the most horrifying biological disasters in maritime history, as the highly contagious norovirus spread like wildfire through passenger and crew populations, transforming luxury vacation vessels into floating hospitals, where over 700 people across several ships were simultaneously struck down by violent illness that left them vomiting, suffering explosive diarrhea, and collapsing in their own waste while overwhelmed medical facilities struggled to contain an outbreak that seemed to grow stronger and more virulent with each passing hour. The norovirus, sometimes called the cruise ship virus, because of its tendency to spread rapidly in confined spaces with high population density, is a particularly vicious pathogen that attacks the digestive system with devastating efficiency, causing symptoms so severe that healthy adults can be reduced to helpless invalids within hours of infection, unable to control their bodily functions while experiencing dehydration, fever, and abdominal cramping that leaves victims writhing in agony and begging for relief that may not come for days. The Royal Caribbean's Oasis of the Seas was one of the first vessels to report significant illness among passengers and crew members, but what initially appeared to be a manageable outbreak of food poisoning quickly revealed itself to be something far more sinister and dangerous as the number of affected individuals grew exponentially, and the ship's medical facilities became overwhelmed by the sheer volume of people requiring immediate treatment for severe dehydration, uncontrollable vomiting, and diarrhea, so violent that many passengers were unable to make it to bathroom facilities before losing control of their bowel functions. The ship's medical staff, trained to handle typical cruise-related injuries and minor illnesses, found themselves facing a biological crisis that required resources, expertise, and isolation capabilities that simply didn't exist aboard a passenger vessel designed for entertainment rather than epidemic management. What made this outbreak particularly terrifying was the speed and efficiency with which the norovirus spread through the ship's population, moving from passenger to passenger through contaminated surfaces, airborne droplets, and person-to-person contact that was impossible to prevent in the close quarters and social environment that cruise ships are specifically designed to promote among their guests. The virus demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to find new victims, spreading through dining areas where infected passengers had touched serving utensils, through elevator buttons pressed by contaminated hands, through door handles, handrails, and countless other surfaces that became vectors for transmission faster than cleaning crews could sanitize them, creating an environment where simply walking through the ship's public areas became a game of biological Russian roulette. Passengers who had paid thousands of dollars for dream vacations found themselves trapped in their cabins, too sick to leave their beds while their bodies expelled fluids from both ends with such violence and frequency that they became dangerously dehydrated and weak, unable to keep down even small sips of water, while the ship's overtaxed medical staff struggled to provide IV fluids and anti-nausea medications to hundreds of people simultaneously. The ship's housekeeping staff, already working under difficult conditions, were forced to deal with biohazardous waste on an unprecedented scale as passengers lost control of their bodily functions in hallways, elevators, restaurants, and public areas, creating contamination hazards that spread the virus even further, while exposing cleaning personnel to infection risks that many of them were not adequately trained or equipped to handle safely. The psychological horror of the outbreak was amplified by the complete breakdown of normal social conventions and human dignity that occurred as passengers were reduced to their most basic biological functions, unable to maintain privacy or composure while suffering from an illness that stripped away every pretense of civilization and left them helplessly dependent on others for the most basic care and assistance. Families with young children face the nightmare of watching their kids suffer from severe dehydration and uncontrollable illness while being unable to provide adequate help or comfort, as parents who were themselves sick struggled to care for children who were crying, vomiting, and soiling themselves while the ship's medical facilities became increasingly overwhelmed and unable to provide timely treatment for the most vulnerable passengers. The ship's dining facilities, which should have been centers of enjoyment and social interaction, became potential death traps, where every surface, utensil, and food item could harbor the virus and infect anyone who came into contact with contaminated materials, forcing the crew to implement increasingly desperate quarantine measures that essentially shut down all food service operations, while passengers who were still healthy enough to eat found themselves with limited access to safe nutrition and clean water. The ship's restaurants, buffets, and bars were transformed from luxurious amenities into biohazard zones that required constant decontamination by crew members who were themselves at high risk of infection and often working while sick, creating a vicious cycle where the people responsible for containing the outbreak were becoming victims themselves and further compromising the ship's ability to respond effectively to the crisis. As news of the outbreak spread to other vessels in the fleet, similar incidents began occurring aboard multiple ships simultaneously, suggesting either a common source of contamination in the cruise line's supply chain or a particularly virulent strain of norovirus that was spreading between vessels through crew transfers, shared supplies, or port facilities that served multiple ships, creating a fleet-wide biological disaster that threatened to overwhelm the entire cruise industry's ability to provide medical care and maintain passenger safety. The coordinated nature of these multiple outbreaks raised disturbing questions about whether cruise lines had adequate protocols for preventing cross-contamination between vessels, and whether their cost-cutting measures in areas like food storage, water treatment, and crew health monitoring had created systemic vulnerabilities that allowed pathogens to spread throughout their operations. The Celebrity Eclipse, another vessel in the Royal Caribbean Fleet, reported similar outbreak patterns at approximately the same time, with passengers and crew members falling ill at rates that suggested person-to-person transmission was occurring faster than containment measures could be implemented, creating a situation where the ship's medical facilities were completely overwhelmed, while hundreds of people suffered from severe illness that required immediate medical attention that simply wasn't available aboard a vessel designed for recreation rather than hospital-level care. The medical staff aboard these ships, typically consisting of a few doctors and nurses trained to handle routine injuries and minor illnesses, found themselves facing a biological crisis that would have challenged major metropolitan hospitals with full infectious disease departments and unlimited resources. The containment efforts implemented by cruise line medical teams proved woefully inadequate for dealing with a pathogen as contagious and persistent as norovirus, with passengers who thought they had recovered from their initial illness often experiencing relapses or reinfection, as the virus continued to circulate through the ship's population and environment, creating a nightmare scenario where people who had endured days of severe illness found themselves becoming sick again, just as they thought their ordeal was ending. The virus demonstrated an almost malicious persistence, surviving on surfaces for weeks despite intensive cleaning efforts and remaining infectious in microscopic quantities that made complete eradication nearly impossible aboard a vessel where thousands of people were living, eating, and sharing facilities in close proximity. The cruise line's response to these outbreaks was characterized by the same corporate damage control mentality that has defined the industry's approach to passenger safety throughout its history, with company representatives initially downplaying the severity of the illness, minimizing the number of affected passengers, and focusing more on protecting the company's stock price and reputation than on providing adequate medical care and support for the hundreds of people who were suffering from a preventable disease outbreak that resulted directly from inadequate sanitation protocols and cost-cutting measures that prioritized profit over passenger health. The company's public relations teams worked overtime to craft messaging that would minimize legal liability and financial consequences, while passengers continued to suffer from an illness that could have been prevented through proper food handling, water treatment, and sanitation procedures that cruise lines routinely ignore or implement inadequately to save money on operational costs. The long-term health consequences of the norovirus outbreaks extended far beyond the immediate illness experienced during the cruise, with many passengers reporting persistent digestive problems, food sensitivities, and chronic fatigue that lasted for months after their recovery from the acute phase of the infection, suggesting that the virus had caused lasting damage to their immune systems and digestive tract that would require ongoing medical treatment and lifestyle modifications long after their cruise vacation had ended. Children and elderly passengers were particularly vulnerable to these long-term effects, with some requiring hospitalization and intensive medical intervention to address complications like severe dehydration, electrolyte imbalances, and secondary infections that developed as a result of their compromised immune systems and the stress that the norovirus had placed on their bodies. The psychological trauma experienced by passengers during these outbreaks was severe and long-lasting, with many people reporting anxiety, panic attacks, and post-traumatic stress symptoms triggered by memories of being helplessly ill while trapped aboard a ship where adequate medical care was unavailable and the most basic human dignity was impossible to maintain. Families described the horror of watching their children suffer while being unable to provide effective help, and many passengers reported feeling abandoned and betrayed by cruise lines that had promised them safe, enjoyable vacations, but instead delivered experiences that resembled biological warfare more than recreational travel. The investigation into these outbreaks revealed systematic failures in cruise ship sanitation protocols, food safety procedures, and medical preparedness that demonstrated the industry's fundamental disregard for passenger health and safety in favor of operational efficiency and profit maximization, with inspectors finding evidence of contaminated food storage areas, inadequate water treatment systems, and cleaning procedures that were insufficient to prevent the spread of highly contagious pathogens in the closed environment of a cruise ship. The cruise line's cost-cutting measures had created perfect conditions for disease outbreaks by reducing staff training, eliminating redundant safety systems, and implementing cleaning protocols that prioritized speed and cost savings over thoroughness and effectiveness. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the norovirus outbreaks of 2019 were not isolated incidents, but part of a recurring pattern of disease outbreaks aboard cruise ships that demonstrates the industry's inability or unwillingness to implement adequate public health measures to protect their passengers from preventable illnesses that can transform dream vacations into medical nightmares. The cruise industry's response to these repeated health crises has been to improve their legal defense strategies and public relations capabilities, rather than address the underlying sanitation and safety deficiencies that continue to put passengers at risk every time they board one of these floating petri dishes that are specifically designed to maximize passenger density and social interaction while minimizing the operational costs that would be required to maintain truly safe and sanitary conditions. The norovirus nightmare serves as a horrifying reminder that when you step aboard a cruise ship, you are entering an environment where your health and safety are secondary considerations to corporate profit margins, and where a single contaminated surface or infected crew member can trigger a biological disaster that will leave you helplessly ill, while trapped in international waters where proper medical care is unavailable. And your only option is to endure days or weeks of severe illness while praying that you survive long enough to reach port and receive the medical attention that should have been available to prevent your suffering in the first place. Story 8. The Honeymoon Murder, Lonnie Kocontes and the Perfect Crime. On May 26, 2013, newlyweds Lonnie Kocontes and Mickey Keinsaki boarded the Rindam cruise ship in Greece for what was supposed to be a romantic Mediterranean honeymoon celebrating their recent marriage. But instead of creating beautiful memories together, this voyage would end with Mickey's mysterious death and her husband's emergence as the prime suspect in what investigators would later determine was a cold-blooded murder disguised as suicide, orchestrated by a man who had married his victim specifically to kill her and collect on a massive life insurance policy that would make him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. Lonnie Kocontes was a 61-year-old businessman from California who had been married twice before, with a history of failed relationships and financial difficulties that had left him desperate for money and apparently willing to commit the ultimate crime to solve his problems, while 52-year-old Mickey Kainsaki was a successful businesswoman and loving mother who believed she had found her soulmate in Cocontes, never suspecting that the man she had married was actually a predator who saw her not as a wife to cherish, but as a victim to exploit and ultimately destroy for financial gain. The couple had met through mutual friends and had what appeared to be a whirlwind romance that culminated in their marriage just months before the fateful cruise, but investigators would later discover that Cocontes had been systematically planning Mickey's murder from almost the moment they met, taking out multiple life insurance policies on her life worth over $1 million while researching methods of killing someone aboard a cruise ship in international waters where jurisdiction would be unclear and investigation would be complicated by the complex legal framework governing crimes committed on the high seas. Cocontes had carefully chosen the Mediterranean cruise specifically because it would take the ship through multiple international jurisdictions where conflicting laws and bureaucratic confusion could help him avoid prosecution, while also providing him with the perfect opportunity to kill his wife and dispose of her body in waters so deep that it would never be recovered and forensic evidence would be impossible to obtain. The first few days of the cruise appeared normal to other passengers and crew members, with the couple participating in ship activities, dining together, and seeming to enjoy their honeymoon like any other newlyweds celebrating their marriage. But behind this facade of marital bliss, Cocontes was carefully executing his murder plan, while Mickey remained completely unaware that she was living the final days of her life with a man who was systematically preparing to end it. Cocontes had been studying his wife's routines, identifying the optimal time and location for the murder, and establishing an alibi that would make it appear that Mickey had committed suicide due to previously unknown mental health issues that he would claim had suddenly emerged during their honeymoon. On the night of May 26th, Cocontes put his plan into action, likely drugging Mickey to make her unconscious or semi-conscious before physically overpowering her and throwing her overboard from their cabin balcony, then staging the scene to make it appear that she had jumped voluntarily while experiencing a psychological breakdown that had caught him completely by surprise. The murder was executed with cold precision, with Cocontes taking care to remove any evidence that might suggest foul play while creating false evidence that would support his narrative of sudden suicide, including disturbing the cabin in ways that would suggest a struggle with mental illness rather than physical violence. When Cocontes reported his wife missing to ship security the following morning, his performance was so convincing that crew members initially accepted his story about finding their cabin empty and assuming that Mickey had gone for an early morning walk, only to discover that she was nowhere to be found on the ship and must have somehow gone overboard during the night. His explanation that Mickey had been acting strangely and possibly suffering from depression was supported by his apparent emotional distress and his cooperation with the ship's search efforts, creating the impression that he was a devastated husband who had been blindsided by his wife's tragic suicide rather than the calculating killer who had orchestrated her death. The ship's crew conducted a mandatory search of the vessel and the surrounding waters, but Cocontes had chosen his timing carefully, ensuring that Mickey's body would be thrown overboard in deep water during darkness when visibility was poor and recovery would be impossible, leaving no physical evidence of the murder and forcing investigators to rely entirely on circumstantial evidence and Cocontes' own statements about what had happened in their cabin during the night. The lack of witnesses, security camera footage, or physical evidence made it extremely difficult for authorities to prove that a crime had been committed, especially since Cocontes' story about his wife's sudden psychological breakdown was plausible enough to create reasonable doubt about whether her death was murder or suicide. However, as investigators began examining Cocontes' background and the circumstances surrounding his marriage to Mickey, disturbing patterns began to emerge that suggested his wife's death was not the tragic accident he claimed, but the culmination of a carefully planned murder scheme that had been months in the making. The discovery of multiple life insurance policies that Kokontes had taken out on Mickey's life, totaling over $1 million, immediately raised red flags about his motives, especially since these policies had been purchased shortly after their marriage and included provisions that would pay out even if Mickey died by suicide, suggesting that Kokontes had specifically planned to kill her in a way that would appear to be self-inflicted. Further investigation revealed that Kokontes had been researching cruise ship security procedures, international maritime law, and methods of disposing of bodies at sea, using internet searches and library resources to educate himself about the best ways to commit murder aboard a ship without being caught or prosecuted. His search history included queries about life insurance policies, suicide methods, and the legal complexities of crimes committed in international waters, creating a digital trail that clearly demonstrated premeditation and planning that was completely inconsistent with his claims about being surprised by his wife's sudden psychological breakdown. The psychological profile that emerged from interviews with Kokontes' friends, family members, and former romantic partners painted a picture of a manipulative and potentially dangerous individual who had a history of using relationships for financial gain and who had become increasingly desperate as his own financial situation deteriorated and his ability to maintain his lifestyle through legitimate means disappeared. Several of his ex-wives and former girlfriends reported that he had attempted to pressure them into taking out life insurance policies with him as the beneficiary, and that he had shown an unusual interest in their financial assets and inheritance prospects, suggesting that his relationship pattern involved targeting women who could provide him with financial benefits through marriage or death. The jurisdictional complications surrounding Mickey's death initially worked in Kokontes' favor, as authorities in multiple countries struggled to determine who had legal responsibility for investigating and prosecuting the case, with Greek authorities claiming the crime occurred in international waters outside their jurisdiction, while U.S. authorities argued that the case should be handled by the country where the ship was registered, creating legal confusion that allowed Kokontes to return to California and continue his normal life while investigators struggled to build a case against him. This jurisdictional nightmare is exactly what Kokontes had counted on when planning the murder, knowing that the complexity of international maritime law would make prosecution difficult and time-consuming, potentially allowing him to collect on the life insurance policies and disappear before authorities could overcome the legal obstacles to bringing him to trial. However, Mickey's family refused to accept Kokontes' explanation of her death and hired private investigators to conduct their own examination of the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, uncovering additional evidence that supported the theory that she had been murdered rather than committing suicide. The family's investigation revealed that Mickey had been making plans for her future that were completely inconsistent with someone contemplating suicide, including business ventures, travel arrangements, and family commitments that suggested she was looking forward to living rather than planning to end her life. The private investigators also discovered that Kokontes had been in significant financial debt at the time of Mickey's death and that he had been facing potential bankruptcy and other legal problems that would have been solved by her life insurance payouts, providing him with a clear financial motive for murder that completely contradicted his portrayal of himself as a loving husband who had been devastated by his wife's unexpected psychological breakdown. The timing of the insurance policies, combined with his desperate financial situation and his suspicious behavior before and after Mickey's death, created a compelling case for premeditated murder that eventually convinced authorities to overcome the jurisdictional obstacles and pursue criminal charges against him. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the international nature of the crime and the lack of physical evidence, but prosecutors were able to build a circumstantial case based on Kokontes' financial motives, his suspicious behavior, his internet search history, and the testimony of witnesses who described his relationship with Mickey in terms that were inconsistent with his claims about their marriage being happy and his surprise at her supposed suicide. The trial revealed the extent of Kokontes' deception and manipulation, showing how he had systematically lied to investigators, insurance companies, and even Mickey's family about the circumstances of her death while attempting to collect on the life insurance policies that had been his motive for murder all along. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerabilities that cruise ship passengers face when traveling in international waters, where crimes can be difficult to investigate and prosecute due to jurisdictional complications that favor perpetrators who understand how to exploit these legal loopholes for their own benefit. Kokontes had essentially used the international maritime legal system as a weapon against his wife, choosing the location and method of her murder specifically to maximize his chances of avoiding prosecution while collecting on the financial benefits of her death. The psychological horror of Mickey's murder extends beyond the crime itself to encompass the betrayal of trust that occurred when someone she loved and trusted used that relationship to plan and execute her death, transforming what should have been the happiest time of her life into the last days of a murder plot that she never saw coming. The fact that she died believing she was on her honeymoon with a man who loved her, never knowing that he had married her specifically to kill her, adds an element of tragic irony that makes her death even more disturbing and heartbreaking. Lonnie Cocontes was eventually convicted of Mickey's murder and sentenced to life in prison, but the case serves as a terrifying reminder that cruise ships can provide the perfect environment for premeditated murder, where killers can exploit international legal complications, limited security measures, and the isolated environment of the ship to commit crimes that would be much more difficult to execute and conceal on land. Every passenger who boards a cruise ship with someone they trust should remember Mickey Kansaki and understand that the person sleeping next to them in their cabin could potentially be planning their death, using the romantic setting and international waters as cover for crimes that are limited only by the imagination and desperation of those who view their fellow passengers not as human beings deserving of love and protection, but as opportunities for financial gain through the ultimate betrayal of murder disguised as tragedy. Story 9. The Carnival Vista Security Failure. When Safety Systems Collapse. In 2018, the Carnival Vista became the center of a terrifying security breakdown that revealed how quickly a cruise ship's safety systems can completely collapse, leaving thousands of passengers vulnerable to chaos, violence, and criminal activity when the very people responsible for protecting them either abandon their posts or become part of the problem they were hired to prevent. The Carnival Vista, one of the newest and most technologically advanced ships in the fleet, was marketed as having state-of-the-art security systems and highly trained personnel who could handle any emergency situation. But what passengers discovered during a routine Caribbean cruise was that these promises of safety and protection were nothing more than marketing lies designed to conceal a security apparatus that was fundamentally broken, understaffed, and completely unprepared to deal with the criminal elements that had infiltrated both the passenger population and the crew itself. The crisis began on the third night of what should have been a relaxing 7-day cruise, when a massive fight broke out in one of the ship's main entertainment venues between passengers who had been drinking heavily and engaging in increasingly aggressive behavior that the ship's security personnel either failed to notice or chose to ignore until the situation escalated beyond their ability to control. What started as a verbal argument between two groups of passengers quickly devolved into a violent brawl involving dozens of people, with chairs, bottles, and other improvised weapons being used as the ship's inadequate security force proved completely incapable of restoring order or protecting innocent bystanders who found themselves trapped in the middle of a riot that spread throughout multiple decks of the vessel. The ship's security team, which consisted of fewer than a dozen personnel responsible for monitoring over 6,000 passengers and crew members, was immediately overwhelmed by the scale and violence of the disturbance, with several security officers reportedly fleeing their posts rather than attempting to intervene in a situation that had clearly exceeded their training and capabilities. The few security personnel who remained on duty lacked proper equipment, training, or authority to deal with the violent crowd, and their attempts to restore order were met with increased aggression from passengers and crew members who seemed to view the security breakdown as an opportunity to settle personal disputes and engage in criminal behavior without fear of consequences. As news of the security breakdown spread throughout the ship, other areas began experiencing their own incidents of violence, theft, and vandalism, as passengers and crew members realized that normal law enforcement was essentially non-existent and that they could engage in criminal behavior with little risk of being caught or punished. The ship's bars and restaurants became scenes of chaos as fights broke out over seating, service, and perceived slights, while the casino and shopping areas experienced a wave of theft and destruction as individuals took advantage of the security vacuum to steal merchandise, money, and personal belongings from other passengers and the ship's commercial operations. The ship's medical facility was quickly overwhelmed by casualties from the various violent incidents occurring throughout the vessel, with the limited medical staff unable to provide adequate treatment for the growing number of passengers and crew members who required immediate attention for injuries ranging from cuts and bruises to serious trauma that would normally require hospital-level care. The medical bay itself became a dangerous environment as injured and intoxicated individuals continued their conflicts even while seeking treatment, creating additional hazards for medical personnel who were already struggling to cope with a patient load that far exceeded their capacity and resources. The breakdown of security and order aboard the Carnival Vista revealed the shocking inadequacy of the ship's emergency communication systems, which proved completely unable to coordinate response efforts or provide passengers with reliable information about their safety and the steps being taken to restore order. The ship's public address system was either not functioning properly or was being deliberately ignored by passengers who had lost faith in the crews to protect them, while the emergency communication protocols that were supposed to connect the ship with Coast Guard and other emergency services either failed to work or were not properly implemented by crew members who seemed as confused and frightened as the passengers they were supposed to be helping. The captain's response to the crisis was characterized by indecision, poor communication, and a fundamental failure to implement the emergency procedures that should have been activated immediately when it became clear that the ship's security systems had completely collapsed. Rather than declaring a shipboard emergency and requesting immediate assistance from Coast Guard and other maritime authorities, the captain and senior officers seemed more concerned about avoiding negative publicity and minimizing the company's legal liability than about protecting the thousands of people whose safety was their primary responsibility. The psychological impact of the security breakdown on passengers was severe and long-lasting, with many people reporting that they felt completely abandoned and vulnerable during the hours when violence and criminal activity were occurring throughout the ship without any effective response from the crew or security personnel. Families with children were particularly traumatized by the experience of being trapped aboard a vessel where normal safety protections had disappeared and where they could not rely on the ship's staff to protect them from other passengers who had become increasingly aggressive and unpredictable as the situation deteriorated. The failure of the ship's surveillance and monitoring systems during the crisis raised disturbing questions about whether these security measures were actually functional or were merely cosmetic features designed to create the illusion of safety without providing any real protection for passengers who might find themselves in dangerous situations. Multiple incidents of violence and criminal activity occurred in areas that should have been covered by security cameras and monitored by trained personnel, but the lack of any effective response suggested that these systems were either not working properly or were being ignored by security staff who were either incompetent or had abandoned their responsibilities. The incident also exposed the dangerous overcrowding that exists aboard modern cruise ships, where thousands of passengers are packed into relatively small spaces with inadequate security personnel, insufficient emergency resources, and limited ability to isolate or contain problems when they arise. The ship's design, which maximizes passenger capacity to increase revenue, created conditions where violent incidents could spread rapidly throughout the vessel and where security personnel could not effectively monitor or control the behavior of passengers who chose to engage in criminal activity. The cruise line's response to the security breakdown followed their standard pattern of damage control and legal liability minimization, with corporate representatives initially denying that any serious incidents had occurred and later claiming that the isolated problems had been quickly resolved by competent crew members who had followed proper procedures throughout the crisis. The company's lawyers immediately began working to prevent passengers from discussing their experiences publicly or seeking legal remedies for the trauma and injuries they had suffered during the security breakdown. The investigation into the incident revealed that Carnival had been aware of security deficiencies aboard the Vista for months before the crisis occurred, but had chosen not to address these problems because of the costs associated with hiring additional security personnel, upgrading equipment, and implementing proper training programs that might have prevented the breakdown from occurring. Internal company documents showed that executives had been warned about the potential for security failures, but had decided that the financial risks of lawsuits and negative publicity were acceptable compared to the costs of maintaining adequate safety systems. The long-term consequences of the Carnival Vista security breakdown extended far beyond the immediate trauma experienced by passengers during the crisis, revealing systemic problems with cruise ship safety that affect the entire industry and put millions of passengers at risk every year. The incident demonstrated that cruise lines consistently prioritize profit margins over passenger safety, creating conditions where security systems are inadequate, emergency procedures are not properly implemented, and passengers are left vulnerable to violence and criminal activity that could be prevented through proper staffing, training, and equipment. The Carnival Vista security failure serves as a terrifying reminder that when passengers board cruise ships, they are entering environments where their safety depends entirely on corporate security systems that may be fundamentally inadequate and may collapse completely when faced with real emergencies that require competent leadership, adequate resources, and proper training, that cruise lines are often unwilling to provide because of the costs involved in maintaining truly effective safety measures. Story 10. Anthem of the Seas. When Nature Becomes the Enemy. 13 to 14 minutes. On February 6, 2016, the Royal Caribbean cruise ship Anthem of the Seas, carrying over 6,000 passengers and crew members on what was supposed to be a routine Bahamas cruise, sailed directly into one of the most violent and terrifying storms in modern maritime history, where hurricane-force winds exceeding 125 miles per hour and waves towering over 30 feet high transformed the massive 1,141-foot vessel into a helpless toy being battered by forces of nature so overwhelming that passengers and crew were certain they were about to die in one of the most horrific maritime disasters ever recorded. Captain Keith Svensson, despite receiving multiple weather warnings and having access to sophisticated meteorological equipment that clearly showed the dangerous storm system directly in their path, made the catastrophically reckless decision to proceed with the cruise rather than return to port or alter course to avoid the tempest, apparently prioritizing the cruise line's schedule and profit margins over the safety of the thousands of people whose lives depended on his competent seamanship and sound judgment. The Anthem of the Seas was one of Royal Caribbean's newest and most technologically advanced vessels, marketed as virtually unsinkable and equipped with state-of-the-art stabilization systems, navigation equipment, and safety features that were supposed to protect passengers from exactly the kind of extreme weather conditions that the ship was about to encounter. But no amount of modern technology could prepare the vessel or its terrified passengers for the primal fury of a storm system that seemed determined to demonstrate humanity's complete helplessness when confronted by the raw power of nature at its most violent and unforgiving. The ship's advanced weather routing systems had clearly identified the dangerous storm conditions ahead, but Captain Svensson chose to ignore these warnings and continue sailing directly into what meteorologists were describing as a bomb cyclone, with wind speeds and wave heights that could potentially sink even the largest and most sophisticated cruise ships. As the Anthem of the Seas entered the outer bands of the storm system, passengers initially experienced what seemed like typical rough weather that was unpleasant but not necessarily dangerous, with the ship rolling and pitching in ways that caused seasickness and made movement difficult but didn't immediately suggest the life-threatening conditions that were rapidly approaching as the vessel sailed deeper into the storm's most violent and destructive core. The ship's crew, following corporate policies that prioritized maintaining normal operations and passenger satisfaction over implementing emergency procedures, continued serving meals, operating entertainment venues, and encouraging passengers to participate in scheduled activities, even as weather conditions deteriorated to the point where walking through the ship's corridors became increasingly dangerous due to the violent motion that sent people stumbling into walls, furniture, and each other. By the evening of February 6th, the storm had intensified to the point where the Anthem of the Seas was being subjected to winds that exceeded the design specifications for even the most robust cruise ships, with sustained gusts over 125 miles per hour, creating a howling, screaming nightmare that penetrated every inch of the vessel and filled passengers with primal terror as they realized that they were trapped aboard a ship that was completely at the mercy of natural forces that could easily destroy them all without warning or opportunity for escape. The waves, now towering over 30 feet high and growing larger by the hour, struck the ship with such tremendous force that the entire vessel shuddered and groaned under the impact, creating sounds that passengers described as resembling a giant metal creature being tortured by forces beyond its ability to withstand. The ship's motion became so violent and unpredictable that passengers were thrown from their beds, hurled across their cabins, and slammed into walls and furniture with enough force to cause serious injuries, while unsecured objects throughout the ship became deadly projectiles that flew through the air and struck anyone unfortunate enough to be in their path. Dining room furniture, decorative items, glassware, and even heavy equipment that should have been properly secured broke loose and careened through public areas, creating additional hazards for passengers and crew who were already struggling to maintain their footing on decks that tilted at impossible angles as the ship rode up mountainous waves and then crashed down into the troughs between them with impacts that felt like the vessel was being dropped from great heights onto solid concrete. The psychological terror experienced by passengers was intensified by the ship's design, which included large windows and glass doors that provided spectacular views during normal weather conditions, but became sources of horror as passengers watched massive walls of water rise above the ship and crash down with such force that many people were convinced the glass would shatter and flood the interior spaces where they were trapped. Children screamed in terror as they watched the ocean rise above them like a green and white mountain before crashing down on the ship with impacts that shook the entire vessel and made it feel as though they were inside a tin can being beaten with giant hammers by forces that wanted to crush them all into oblivion. The ship's crew, who should have been trained to handle emergency situations and provide leadership and reassurance during times of crisis, instead seemed just as terrified and helpless as the passengers they were supposed to protect, with many crew members abandoning their posts and seeking shelter in interior areas of the ship, while passengers were left to fend for themselves in conditions that would have challenged experienced sailors aboard purpose-built naval vessels designed for extreme weather operations. The few crew members who remained at their stations provided contradictory and often completely inaccurate information about the ship's condition and the expected duration of the storm, creating additional confusion and panic among passengers who desperately needed reliable information about their safety and survival prospects. The ship's medical facilities were quickly overwhelmed by passengers and crew members who had been injured by the violent motion and flying debris, with broken bones, lacerations, concussions, and other trauma-related injuries requiring immediate treatment that the limited medical staff was unable to provide adequately, while the ship continued to be battered by waves and winds that made normal medical procedures nearly impossible to perform safely. The medical bay itself became a dangerous environment where patients were thrown from examination tables and medical equipment became additional hazards, as the ship's violent motion made it impossible to provide proper care for the growing number of injured people who required treatment. The dining areas, which should have been closed and secured once dangerous weather conditions became apparent, instead remained open until the storm's violence made continued operations impossible, resulting in horrific scenes where passengers were struck by flying furniture, scalded by spilled hot liquids, and injured by broken glass and debris as the ship's motion transformed restaurant equipment and serving items into weapons that caused additional casualties among people who were simply trying to find food and water during their ordeal. The ship's pools became death traps as the violent motion caused water to slosh back and forth with such force that anyone near the pool areas risked being swept away or struck by the massive volumes of water that moved like tsunamis across the deck surfaces. The storm's duration was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the ordeal, as passengers who initially hoped that the rough weather would pass quickly realized that they were trapped in conditions that seemed to worsen by the hour rather than improve, creating a sense of hopelessness and despair that was amplified by the crew's obvious inability to control the situation or provide accurate estimates of when the nightmare would end. Hours stretched into what felt like days as passengers huddled in their cabins or sought shelter in interior areas of the ship, listening to the sounds of the vessel being torn apart by forces that seemed determined to destroy everything in their path while praying that the ship's hull would remain intact long enough for them to survive until calmer weather arrived. The communication systems aboard the ship proved inadequate for keeping passengers informed about their situation, with the public address system often inaudible over the sound of howling wind and crashing waves, while the ship's internet and phone services failed completely, leaving passengers unable to contact their families or emergency services to report their desperate situation and request assistance if the ship's condition deteriorated beyond the crew's ability to maintain control. This isolation added another layer of terror to an already horrific situation, as passengers realized that they were completely cut off from the outside world and dependent entirely on the ship's crew and equipment to survive conditions that seemed capable of destroying even the most advanced maritime technology. The storm's impact on the ship's mechanical systems created additional dangers as power fluctuations and equipment failures left passengers in darkness during some of the most terrifying moments of the ordeal, while the ship's stabilization systems proved inadequate for dealing with waves and winds that exceeded their design parameters, leaving the vessel to be tossed around like a cork in a bathtub by forces that rendered human technology virtually useless. The failure of various ship systems created cascading problems that made the crew's job of maintaining safety and control increasingly difficult as the storm continued to batter the vessel with unrelenting fury. When daylight finally arrived and the storm began to weaken, passengers emerged from their hiding places to discover a ship that had been transformed into a disaster zone, with damaged furniture, broken glass, flooded areas, and debris scattered throughout the vessel's public and private spaces, while many passengers and crew members required medical attention for injuries that ranged from minor cuts and bruises to serious trauma that would require hospitalization once the ship reached port. The psychological damage was even more extensive, with many passengers reporting symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, panic attacks, and severe anxiety that would persist long after their physical injuries had healed. Royal Caribbean's response to the Anthem of the Seas disaster followed the company's standard pattern of damage control and legal liability minimization, with corporate representatives initially downplaying the severity of the storm and the danger faced by passengers while claiming that the ship had performed exactly as designed and that the crew had followed proper procedures throughout the ordeal. The company's lawyers immediately began crafting defenses against potential lawsuits while public relations teams worked to minimize media coverage and discourage passengers from discussing their experiences publicly or seeking legal remedies for their trauma and injuries. The investigation into the incident revealed that Captain Svensson had received multiple warnings about the dangerous weather conditions ahead and had been advised by meteorologists and maritime safety experts to alter course or return to port rather than sail directly into the storm, but he had chosen to ignore these warnings in order to maintain the cruise schedule and avoid the financial costs associated with canceling or modifying the voyage. This decision demonstrated the cruise industry's systematic prioritization of profit over passenger safety, with corporate policies that pressure captains to maintain schedules even when doing so puts thousands of lives at risk from preventable dangers. The Anthem of the Seas. Storm disaster serves as a terrifying reminder that cruise ships, despite their size and technological sophistication, remain vulnerable to natural forces that can transform luxury vacation experiences into life-threatening ordeals, where passengers find themselves completely helpless and dependent on the competence and judgment of crew members who may prioritize corporate interests over human safety. Every passenger who boards a cruise ship should understand that they are placing their lives in the hands of people who may be willing to sail directly into dangerous conditions rather than disappoint corporate executives or disappoint passengers who expect their vacation schedules to be maintained regardless of weather conditions or safety considerations that would normally require immediate changes to travel plans. The psychological horror of being trapped aboard a ship during a life-threatening storm extends far beyond the immediate physical dangers, encompassing the complete loss of control and the terrifying realization that survival depends entirely on factors beyond human influence, including the structural integrity of the vessel, the competence of the crew, and the mercy of natural forces that are indifferent to human suffering and completely capable of destroying thousands of lives without warning or opportunity for escape.